Hi, everybody. This is Kerristen, and thank you so much for tuning into another episode of the Relocate Podcast. Keep in mind, I host new episodes every Wednesday, so make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel. Make sure that you are um, following on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So, with that being said, today I have a very lovely guest with us today. Her name is Ambar Paloma, host of the Lighthouse Within podcast. For those of you who are new to Spotify or have been following my Spotify account for a while, you know that I have her podcast pinned to my page. So you can tune into that. Yeah, girl, I got your podcast pin because I feel
I
like
love
it's
that.
important. Yeah, when people relocate, it's more than just emptying and packing boxes and you know just moving from one place to another. There's a psychological aspect to it as well, and I encourage you all who are listening to definitely tune in to the Lighthouse Within because Amber has some great tips on cultivating inner strength and just shifting your mindset so that you can embark on a healthy journey in any type of healing that you may need as you're adjusting to being in a new place. So, Amber, oh, by the way, her podcast, yes, it's on Spotify, but you can also catch it on YouTube. And are there um, any other like platforms that I missed out on?
Yeah, it's also on Apple Podcasts and it's also on Good Pods, which is where I got onto one of their charts recently of their self-improvement weekly chart and their self-improvement monthly chart. So that was pretty exciting, definitely
Yeah.
because of listeners like you who are pumping up the show. Yeah.
Yes, we love to see it. Love to see it. Okay. So yeah, Amber, she currently resides in Lisbon, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yes,
Yep,
Lisbon. Or
Lisbon,
in
Portugal.
Portuguese it's Lisboa. Yeah, in
Oh, that's
Portuguese. Yeah.
cool, Lisboa.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
definitely don't want to go and visit and sound like an American, because America has definitely been disappointing. The U.S. has been disappointing as of late. So
Yes.
I remember
Yeah,
that whenever
and
I'm.
there's so many of us here as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. Okay. So, we're gonna discuss your experience in Portugal, but I also do want to touch bases on how your podcast was inspired by your own life, your life story of overcoming depression and dealing with social anxiety. And I think those are things that a lot of people who move, a lot of people who are relocated and currently settling or trying to find their way, like they're probably dealing with the same thing. I dealt with it. That's for certain. And then we're going to see how all of this plays a role in your relocation journey. But yeah, even before we get to that, I mean, would you mind telling us a little bit about like where you're from and how was your upbringing?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that introduction. It was lovely.
Thank
Yeah, I grew up in Miami, Florida, which I feel like really shaped who I am in a lot of ways. I am the child of two Latino immigrants, so they're both from the Dominican Republic. And so it's a really special thing to grow up in Miami because you're completely surrounded by Latinos. And so I would turn on the TV and I would see like your standard American culture, mac and cheese and fried chicken and Malcolm in the Middle. But in my house, we were playing bachata, merengue, and eating like plantains. So I always feel like I grew up between two cultures and never really felt fully Latina and I never really felt fully American either. But yeah, it was definitely a really special experience growing up in a place like Miami. And I felt like my friend group was so international as well. I had friends who were like half Lebanese, half Cuban, or like half Chinese, half Brazilian. And so I just always grew up in this very multicultural space.
You know how I feel like Miami is its own vibe, it's its own like place separate from Florida. I feel like
Yes.
just like how Like, it's just separate. Like, I don't when I think of Miami, I don't think of Florida, if that makes sense. I think of the United State of Miami. That's how I feel about it.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Whenever like other people come visit us, they're like, "Does anyone speak English around here?" Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that aspect, but it's also not like the rest of the state. It's just different. Yeah. And it's like all
Yeah.
this culture and diversity, and then you got a governor that's pretty much against that.
No, I can't explain any of it. We actually have a joke that Florida is the only state where the more north you go, the more southern you get. Yeah.
That's a good one. It's also very
Yeah.
true. That's very true.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I love that you mentioned your family too. Um, as far as like growing up and having that the Dominican background and being in America. You mentioned that uh it like that shaped you into kind of like the person that you are today. Can you speak a little bit more on that part?
Yeah, I think it really shaped my openness because I was always, surrounded by people from so many different cultures. So, I mean, even just growing up, I had a really close friend from Mexico, someone else from Peru, someone else who was Chinese, someone else who was from Ghana. And so it was always like, there was always a lot of openness, and going over to their house, I would get exposed to their culture, the foods that they ate, their customs, their traditions. And so I think I was always so fascinated by other cultures and other people. And I think it just lent an openness because I also had friends from different religions and different backgrounds who would, share their cultures and traditions with me. And so I just learned a lot of like respect and tolerance from a really young age.
So it wasn't overwhelming, I can imagine, to uproot, to explore other places and and other cities. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think we mentioned you moved to Atlanta eventually, to Georgia.
Yeah, I was going to say I faced more culture shock moving to Atlanta than I did moving to Spain. But yeah, I know. Yes, girl.
Can you speak on that? I'm 'cause I get it, but can you speak on that?
Yeah, I think Atlanta's actually pretty decently multicultural, but I think like most of the Latinos there are like Central American. And so whenever people would meet me, they were like, "So like what are you?" Yeah, I mean even the black people, they'd be like, "You kind of look like us, but not quite." And so that was a very different experience. I think also Southern hospitality was very different. I think Latinos, when they like you and they are like, come over to my barbecue on Saturday, they mean it. Okay. If you don't show up to that barbecue, they're calling you like, yo, where you at? And why didn't you bring your family? They really expect you to show up. But when people in Atlanta invite you to their barbecue, they might just be being polite and making conversation. And that was very confusing to me at first because I think people in Miami are like very, very either outright rude or outright friendly, but you know where you stand. You know what I mean? But with like Southern hospitality, it's like good manners to be friendly, which is kind of nice when you're just passing through. But when you're trying to develop friendships, it's like it was very hard for me to figure out if someone genuinely wanted to hang out with me or if they were just like making polite conversation. And so this felt kind of isolating, or like I felt kind of silly sometimes because I was like, oh, I thought my Emily coworker, like my coworker Emily, truly was inviting me to go thrift shopping in her neighborhood, but she totally wasn't. You know what I mean? So it was different.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yeah. What was your experience like with that?
um, I think I was lucky in a sense, because my perception of Atlanta was influenced by people I already knew who lived there before, and still lived there when I moved there. So I was able to um, adjust fairly well, but I wasn't focused in a sense to like actually do and achieve some of the goals that I had for moving there. I was a little just all over the place. But as far as like meeting people, I struggled like people outside my bubble. I did struggle a bit, but it was mostly because I hate to talk about the scam culture, but the scam culture is real there.
Yeah.
It really is. And in that sense, I'm thinking like everyone has good intentions, but because, I'm from the South too, and I understand what that hospitality means to people. And to come from experience where you never had to worry about people taking advantage of that to being somewhere where people can easily pick up on that and use that to your demise. Yeah, I struggled with that. So, um,
Yeah. Yeah, I
yeah.
feel that.
So, yeah, it was like who's genuine and who's not. And I don't want to play that game. I don't think it's nice. I don't think it's
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was it for me. It's like not knowing who was being genuine and who was just being nice on the surface.
Yeah. And like, are people being nice because they actually really want to get to know you for who you are? Or do they want something out of you? Like, they want, like, do they want to
Yes.
know Amber, or do they want to know you for like what you do for a living and try to, yeah. It's like I came to meet friends, not people who want to take advantage, really. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
Um, did you live anywhere else in the US before you left?
I went to college in Gainesville, Florida. I went to the University of Florida. Go Gators. And then once I finished my master's there, I moved to Atlanta.
Okay. Was that move influenced by a role that you landed in Atlanta, or yeah, was there like any other like sources that like pulled you to Atlanta?
Yes. So I was dating someone at the time who we were like very serious about each other. At the time, we were like talking about potentially marriage. And so we made a list of like places we would be willing to move to. And Atlanta was the only place we had in common. So it was like, oh, I guess we're moving to Atlanta. So yeah, I moved to Atlanta to be with him.
Okay. Oh, okay, great. So, I was gonna ask you about like how, like, at what point did you decide to transition to Europe? Was that I might okay, I'm gonna jump gears if you don't mind. The
Yeah.
person that it sounds like it didn't last, but like, did
No, it did not.
it did not okay. But was this person someone that ended up moving with you to Europe, or how, like, I don't want to get too nosy, but
Yeah, no, it's fine because I shared the whole story of my last episode of my podcast. So, yeah, we moved to Atlanta together, but everything was just like everything was going wrong. I look back on that time in my life and I'm like, wow, God really did not want me with that person and did not want me living in that city because when I tell you literally every aspect of my life like fell apart, um, I felt like at first I felt like I was living a dream because I was dating this person and everyone would like refer to us as like a black power couple. Even like our professors, because we were in the same master's program, our professors would find out that we were dating each other and would be like, oh my God, I love that so much. Like, oh, you guys are so perfect together. I love that you guys are dating. And so we moved to Atlanta, and yeah, just everything went wrong. But initially, I was like, everything's going so great because I got the exact job I wanted. I got the exact apartment in the exact neighborhood. Even the job that I wanted was at the exact company that I wanted to work at. And like, I was moving there with him, and I was so excited. And I had gone to Atlanta a few times, and I did really enjoy it. And so I was excited about moving there initially. And yeah, everything just started going horribly wrong. That job was like so toxic. Like, I literally had to file a report to HR. It was so horribly toxic. Then like my car kept breaking down to the point where like the mechanic knew me by name. Like, he wouldn't even charge me for certain repairs if they were under a certain amount, because he would just be like, "Oh, I know you'll be back." He was, "Oh, back again, Miss Amber." Like, I was so embarrassed every time I rolled up to the mechanic shop, and I was
Those
like
dang
sick all the
potholes.
time. Yes, the potholes, girl, the potholes, the nails in the all of the like constant construction. It was insanity. And yeah, I was sick all the time. The allergies, like, allergy season killed me. I ended up my voice getting like I lost my voice several times because my throat was getting so constricted from like allergy season. And then like that that person I was dating couldn't find a job in Atlanta. Remember, he went on like 100 interviews and couldn't find a job. And then he ended up like moving back to Indianapolis with his like family. He ended up cheating on me. So, just to like make the story worse, and I had like no friends whatsoever. Like, I had some friends, but none that I hung out with all the time. And I just remember I was like, it was bad. Like, it was to a point where I would just like come home every day and I would cry. And I remember like I have a very vivid memory of calling my dad and being like, "Papi, I think I'm too young to be this unhappy with my life." And yeah, but it all culminated in this one night where I was like sitting with one of my coworkers. So she had these like three sweet kids that sometimes I would babysit. Oh yes, because on top of it all, I just like couldn't make ends meet. And so I was like babysitting for extra money on the side. And so yeah, I would sometimes babysit her kids, and she comes home one day when I was babysitting them, and she's like, "Amber, you seem so unhappy." She's like, "You're always talking about Spain." She's like, "Why don't you just like quit your job and go teach English in Spain?" And I was just like, "Stephanie, I can't do that. Like, I'm the child of immigrants. Like, are you crazy?" I can't just like give up my stable job in Atlanta just to like go do what? To like teach English in Spain? Like, that's not even my career. And she was just like, why not? She is also Colombian, so she was also the child of immigrants. And so she said it from like a very, I understand where you're coming from perspective. She was like, why not? You're young, you don't have any kids, you don't have a husband, you've just started your career. She's like, you are at the perfect stage in your life to do something incredibly reckless and selfish. And I was like, I don't know, Stephanie, that sounds crazy. And she was like, just think about it. So I go home that night, and I looked up teaching English in Spain, and I come up on the program for CIEE. There's a lot of programs, but that was the one I was looking at. And I entertained it for a thought, and I was like, "Oh, it's too crazy. I can't do this." And I closed the page. And I open up my Facebook, and the first status I see was, "Has anyone ever been to Andalusia in Spain?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why do you ask?" And he goes, "I just got accepted to teach English in Spain through CIEE's program." And I was like, if this is not a sign, if this is not divine intervention, I don't know what is. So I just decided it was a sign, because I was like, what are the chances? And I applied to the program. I ended up getting accepted. I got sent to the same city as that friend, and I just like I quit the job. I sold everything in my apartment, like no qualms. Like every time someone would come, they'd be like, "Wow, this is a perfectly good couch. Why are you getting rid of it?" I was like, "Because I'm moving to Spain." I was like on cloud nine. But yeah, that's my story. And it's actually I quite love the story. Yeah.
I know that's right. Take the pillows too, cause I'm going to Spain.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can have the shoe rack. What else do you want? You want the screws and the
Yes.
forks too?
Girl, everything. Whatever wasn't sold, like dropped it off at Goodwill or like a Boys and Girls Club. Like, yeah.
Oh man, your story feels like, or it reminds me of the point in my Houston experience where I felt like things weren't working out. I mean, at one time I had 3 jobs.
Wow,
And
girl.
that was a lot. Like I was really fighting to stay, and I was holding on to the thought of if I leave, I feel like a failure. And when you mentioned like, dang, I am the child of immigrants, and I mean, I can imagine that when people immigrate to the U.S. and they have children, they they want their child to like really live that quote unquote the American dream and really just take advantage of all the opportunities that you know the parents and grandparents didn't have, living in another country. So I'm curious to know, how did your folks feel when you said I'm leaving the United States? How did they feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think to what you say, they say that no one believes in the American dream more than an immigrant. Um and I really have to say, like, my parents really raised me with that, like, you can do anything that you put your mind to because this is America kind of mentality. And I am grateful for that because I think, like, I'm very ambitious for that reason. But when I told my dad that I was moving, I was like, "Papi, I'm moving to Spain." He simply said, "No." I was like, "No." But I was just kind of like, "Well, you don't pay my bills, so I'm gonna go do what I want to do."
Yes, I know that's right. You go, girl.
Yeah. My mom,
Stand
on
your
the other
ground.
hand, thought it was the coolest thing. She was like, "Wow, I know people who don't even go to the bathroom by themselves, and you're just gonna move to Spain." Yeah.
Oh, go mom. I know that's right. You better root for your child, baby, to do to prosper and do good things in a whole different country. Yes,
Yeah.
I'll trump your America and give you Spain. I'll give you Europe.
Yes.
Like, this is
Yes.
chess, not checkers. So I love that. I mean, I'm sure, that wasn't something that they envisioned, but I think that's the beauty too of the American dream in a sense. Like you have liberty to go to most countries and not have to jump through as many hoops. I'm still learning about the process. I know like other countries, they won't even entertain the thought of people living people moving there unless you have um like ancestry. So
Yeah.
it's, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting how that process goes. But okay, well, we defied that and we went to Europe, and I know that's right. I mean, welcome to Spain. Like you're in a new place. Um, I can imagine that while being in an unfamiliar like place, everything seems new. That process of transitioning, like it took a bit of paperwork and time to get there? Like, how was that process from the point where you applied and and got the acceptance to actually relocating?
Yeah, I always say that moving to Spain was a lot easier for me than it was to move to Portugal. And I think part of that is because CIEE, so you do pay to be a part of this program. At the time, it was about $1,000 because they facilitate a lot of the immigration process. And there are other like free programs that you can do that you just like apply to teach English in Spain, and it is completely free to apply and go, but you have to do all the paperwork by yourself. And as someone who was like moving abroad for the first time, I was actually really grateful I paid that $1,000 just to have like one less headache. But yeah, it was a lot easier, I think, because I also spoke the language. And so, because I had a job there, I automatically had coworkers who were like very interested in getting to know the American who was there from Miami to teach them English. And because I was moving through this program, they have teachers from, well, teaching assistants really from the US, from Canada, Ireland, England, Australia, so any native English speaking country can apply to this program. And so they have these teaching assistants placed all over the country, and they put you in lots of like meetups and other like events to get to know each other. So it felt a little bit easier to integrate and like find friends and find community than like when I moved to Portugal, which was entirely on my own.
Okay. Well, that's nice that they have those processes in place to make that transition a little more seamless. Because I didn't know that there was an aspect, and I be on threads and I try to keep up with everyone else's messages. And you mentioned an immigration lawyer, and I don't think I didn't think that that was a thing until you mentioned it. Was that a service that you took advantage of when you moved from Spain to Portugal?
I did not. I did the whole process by myself, which is why I
Okay.
can 100% tell you it was incredibly overwhelming. And I don't fault anyone who chooses to hire help because it was very stressful. And the reason I didn't hire one was because I didn't want to pay thousands of dollars for one. And I didn't have that kind of money. And I already needed a lot of money to move to Portugal. I probably needed about 20,000 for the whole process. So trying to get an extra 3,000 to pay a lawyer to do something I could technically do myself just wasn't in the cards for me. But if you have that kind of money, it is definitely worth it, I would say, just to have one less thing on your plate.
$20,000.
Yes. Yes, and most of it goes to you, but I'll so basically you need to put around $11,000 into a Portuguese bank account just to just to say you have $11,000 in a Portuguese bank account. They don't charge you this money. You can, once you move to Portugal, you can use it for whatever you want. But they use this as a way to prove that you have enough funds to be in the country. The other thing I needed was a down payment on a apartment because you need a lease to even apply. So before you're even accepted, you have to put a down payment on a place and start paying rent on a place, not even knowing if you'll get this visa. So I needed about 3 months rent just as a deposit. But for foreigners, sometimes it can go as high as 6 months rent up front. And I've heard some people even paying a whole year's worth of rent up front just to get a spot. Yeah, especially cities like Lisbon, Porto, areas like the Algarve that have a lot of American immigrants and a lot of British immigrants. There is a bit of a housing crisis. And because these countries are on the socialist side, so once you get into their house, they're technically not legally allowed to kick you out of the house because housing is kind of considered more of a right here. And if you are like a parent, if you are a parent with children, it's even harder to kick someone out of your property, even if they're not paying for rent. Um, and so obviously landlords have like less ways to check foreigners when they're coming and renting their properties. So sometimes they'll ask for these ridiculous deposits. So between like, funding the bank account, paying for my rent before I even moved, and paying the deposit, as well as paying to come to Lisbon and house shop, it was about $20,000. Yeah.
How long was that process for you?
Yeah, so I would say I started the process in October very slowly. Um, I came to Portugal for a month in February because I had actually never been to Lisbon when I decided to move here. I had been to Portugal, but not Lisbon. And so I was like, okay, let me make sure that I like Lisbon before I commit. And then I was like, and I'll give myself a month to find an apartment if I do like it. And then I think I turned everything in March once I had the bank account and all of that stuff. And then I got approved early May and I moved mid May.
Okay. 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 Portugal. Cool. All right. Oh, so the program that you mentioned, CI, what were the acronyms again?
It's CIEE for the paid version, but if you're interested in doing the free version, it's called the North American Culture and Language Assistance, I think. So just look that up, North American Culture and Language Assistant, Spain, and it is completely free. It's funded by the government. They pay you a monthly allowance as well. If you work in one of the like the southern region, which is where I worked, you only work 12 hours a week. And at the time, they were paying around 700 euros a month. Doesn't sound like a lot, but my rent was about 180 a month. My groceries were about 100 a month. My phone bill was 15 euros a month. So if you add all of that up, I'm sitting around like 300 euros. So the other 400 euros I was just using to travel around Spain. And then the rest of the time when I wasn't working at the school, I was just hanging out. I was traveling. And then I eventually used some of the time to start building my social media business, which is what I used to then later on apply for the digital nomad visa in Portugal. Oh, sorry, my my laundry.
It's okay. It's a pleasant tune, by the way. Um, and mine's just a and that's it. So it's a very pleasant
Yeah.
tune.
Yeah.
So before we get into your lifestyle in Portugal now, oh, congratulations that you were able to make it through, that whole process, by the way. I think that's pretty cool. Before we get into Portugal, my mind is still kind of on how things just went left in Atlanta prior to you moving to Europe. How were you able to navigate all of that, the breakup, the toxic work environment? Did you have enough time to even process that before you relocated again to Europe?
Honestly, in a way, no, and in a way, yes, because I quite quit that job for months. So I applied to the program maybe around August, but I didn't leave until December. So that whole time I kept working, just like saving up money. But at that point in the back of my mind, anytime something went wrong, I was like, I don't care because I'm moving to Spain. And I think that like carried me through those last few months. But I remember that when I was like driving my car down from Atlanta to Miami and I passed that like state line where it says like you're now leaving Georgia and I saw the sign that is like welcome to Florida, I literally just started bawling. It was like everything I had been like holding back, I just started bawling. And it felt like those first few months in Spain was like a big release because I was suddenly living, I mean, I was truly living my best life. I was, I was traveling all over the place. I was meeting people. I felt like I was coming out of my shell. I was like finding a different side of myself as well. So there was a lot of self discovery going on at this stage. And it felt like I was really processing everything that happened in Atlanta. And I was just so happy to have like gotten out of it. So I think sometimes, kind of what you're saying with your Houston story, sometimes when you're in the thick of a bad situation, you sometimes ask yourself, like, is it just me? Am I over exaggerating this in my mind? Am I just being weak? Am I being sensitive? Is this what life is supposed to be like? And it isn't until you're like out of that situation looking back that you're like, no, that was really bad. And it's sometimes like, that hindsight is 2020, that you're like, okay, I'm so happy that I was out of that situation. But also I think it getting so bad was what drove me to make this life-changing decision.
When people get to that point where nothing just feels right, and you kind of get lost in those emotions and tend to make bad decisions. In the midst of chaos, you made a good decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so I would like to just encourage anyone who's tuning in, you know, if you're feeling down and you're feeling like you don't know what's next, it doesn't have to be a bad decision. It doesn't have to be to the point where, a hope is lost, because you see that Amber went through so much, and her way out of that was Spain. I love that.
Yes. Yes, yes.
You said, I need space from all of this mess, and I'm going to give it the distance between. I'm going to give it so much space that, you know, I'm just going to
Yeah.
cross the whole entire Atlantic Ocean to get to
Yes.
the freedom and the peace of mind that I need to move forward. So, I mean, sometimes that's what you have to do. It's Places don't work out sometimes. It just doesn't. And you have to pivot and,
Yeah.
definitely take time to feel the emotions and just process it. And please, sweet baby Jesus, therapy, or, drawing in your faith, whoever you believe in, if you believe in something, and surround yourself with people who's going to uplift you, and tune into the Lighthouse Within podcast, because I swear, like, Amber has a lot of great tools and resources to use, in conjunction with her podcast, to really help you process and think through things. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add to that, Amber.
Yeah. I love what you said about like taking the chance to pivot, because I think sometimes when we find ourselves in those moments where everything is falling apart, we're so stuck in that like, why me? Why is everything going wrong? And I really challenge people, like in those moments when you're feeling like everything is going wrong, if you could instead look at it as an opportunity, like what is this moment an opportunity for? And I think sometimes when everything falls apart, that's your best moment to build something new. And I really think like, you could really use those moments to your advantage. So don't feel disheartened when things fall apart, because it could be the start of the most amazing part of your life.
That's good. That's good. Yay. Okay.
Yay.
Yeah. So I think it's great that, you had the opportunity to live in two countries in Europe. What motivated you to move to Portugal, though? I know you were
Yeah.
excited about
Um
Spain.
Very. Yeah, actually, funny story. When I moved to Spain initially, it was just supposed to be for 6 months. I've officially lived abroad for 6 years now. So I know. I was still, I felt like every time I tried to think about moving back to the US, I was like, well, where would I move? I couldn't really like decide on where I wanted to stay or where I wanted to go back to in the US and what I wanted to go back to. So I just kept like renewing my teacher visa. Like every year I'd be like, okay, one more year, one more year. And then COVID happened. And my mom was a nurse at the time. So she was like, don't come back because we're in Florida and it's like the wild, wild west out here. So she basically told me, she said, stay in Spain until this is over. And then by the time that was quote unquote over, it had been like 3 years of me living in Spain. And I was like, oh, I think this is home now. I really didn't want to go back to the US and I couldn't think of where to go back to. So I started doing the process to stay in Spain. This was before they had a digital nomad visa. And immigration in Spain is kind of tricky because if you ever move to Spain, you will learn that all of the rules and all of the laws just depend on who you talk to. So I would get one set of information from one person, another set of information from somebody else, and then turns out I ended up doing the wrong paperwork. And so I called a lawyer, and the lawyer told me that like I did the wrong thing because I was like, okay, I was supposed to hear back in 20 days. It has now been 3 months. I am here like with expired paperwork. She was like, well, you turned in the wrong thing. That's why. And I was like, oh, great. And I remember at the time she was like, do you have it in writing that they give you the wrong information? Because then we can make a legal case for you to turn in the right paperwork. I said no. So she was like, okay, the best thing for you to do now is to renew your past visa and do it that way. But then I was like, okay, I'll do that. And then she was like, well, the problem is you should have done that a month ago. And I was like, what? Why is everyone in this country like this? So basically she told me, she was like, okay, at this point you need to go back to the US and do the right paperwork correctly from there. And I was like, okay. So I go all the way back to the US, and now I was like, well, let me talk to a different lawyer because clearly she was not a good one. And I talked to multiple lawyers, and they were like, you shouldn't have left the country. It was like you reset your clock. It's like you've never been in Spain. And I was like, you're kidding me. So I was like in shambles. Like I was in tears because I was like, I don't know, I was so stuck on the idea of like living in Spain. I had even been like, okay, I'm going to move from Malaga to Madrid. And like, I'm so excited. And all of a sudden, yeah, they were like, that's not going to be possible unless you want to get a master's degree or go back to teaching English. And I was like, okay, I don't really want to do either. I already have a master's degree, so why would I pay for another one? And then a lot of my friends started being like, "Oh, move to Lisbon, move to Lisbon." And I was like, "I've never been to Lisbon." And they were like, "Just move to Lisbon, you'll love it." So I contacted a lawyer for Lisbon, for Portugal, and I asked about the requirements, and they were like, "Yeah, you meet all of the requirements. If you apply, like you'll probably get accepted." So I was like, "Okay, I guess I'm moving to Lisbon." And I started working on all of the paperwork. And then I remember one day, I was talking to my mom about it, and I was like, "Yeah, mom, I need to put like 10,000 euros in a bank account and get an apartment and all of this stuff." And then she was like, "You should really go to Lisbon to do that in person." And I was like, "No, mom, I'm in a Facebook group with like other people moving." She's like, "That's exactly where the scammers would go." So yeah, she made a good point. So yeah, I came to Lisbon to check it out, and I like immediately fell in love.
Aw. Is the love still there 6 years later?
Yeah, well, I've been
Or
in
five
Lisbon for two and
years?
a half of those 6 years. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I definitely went through a period where I was feeling disillusioned with Lisbon. But the love is there. Yes, the love is back and it's there.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm glad that that things worked out in a way. And how would you? How does the pace of life in Portugal compared to the life you had in the US?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I really wanted to stay in Spain initially, and part of the reason I enjoy Portugal, is that the culture is so much more community oriented. So it's really common to see like they have these little kiosks almost in every single plaza with like tons of chairs and tables and benches where like people could just like grab a drink, whether that's a soda or a glass of wine, and just like sit out and chat with each other. And I mean, like within a 5 minute walk of me, I probably have at least four of those kinds of plazas, including like then there's the cafes and the restaurants and all of this stuff. So it's like you walk outside and you just always see people chatting with each other, meeting new people, like building community. And it's just such a nice thing to walk outside and everyone just like says hello to you, and like you slowly start to get to know your neighborhood, and not just your neighbors, but like the shop owners and the people at the coffee shop. And if you go to a place enough times, you'll get to know the people who frequent it. So it's really nice. I really love it.
And I know that you have the Spanish language under your belt, but how was that transition from having like Spanish, being spoken most of the time in Spain? At least I think, that's probably how the experience went, but definitely correct me if I'm wrong. But, going from a country where you're speaking the official language is Spanish to Portuguese, like how was that learning curve for you?
Yeah. I think if you don't know the local language, Portugal is probably one of the best places to move because their level of English is so good. Like so good. In Spain, I feel like no one speaks English, but in Portugal, almost everyone speaks English to a very high degree. So I think if you don't know the local language, it's an easier place to move to in terms of like getting care at a hospital or like a medical center, the pharmacy, or even talking to the police or doing some kind of bureaucratic process. It's a lot easier. With that said, I feel like it was much harder for me to integrate or for me to feel like a part of Portugal or a part of the community. Because like in Spain, I knew Spanish and I grew up speaking it because of my family. And so I had a lot of friends who were Spanish speakers who would invite me to like Spanish traditions and all of these things, or like, even knowing the people at the coffee shop would sit down and chat with me and ask me about my family. So I felt very integrated into the local community. Whereas, like, when I first moved to Portugal, I didn't. And I think that was like one of the reasons at one point, like, I felt kind of like an outsider here and was kind of like missing Spain a lot. But I made a big effort to learn Portuguese. And now, like, I do all of my, like, I go to the doctor's office and I speak in Portuguese. When, like, I go get my eyebrows done. My girl's from Brazil, so I speak to her in Portuguese, and it's just so nice to be able to like connect with people in their language, and also like they teach me things all of the time, and I just feel so much more integrated that way.
Earlier, you mentioned that when you moved to Atlanta, people were kind of looking at you and they were like, "Are you black or are you like, what are you?" Did you get that same experience when you were in Spain or Portugal?
When I was in Spain, I think people were confused about me because if I didn't open my mouth and speak to them, they thought I was British for some reason. I feel like Spanish people aren't really exposed to outsiders, so they're like, "Oh, English speaker, you must be from England." Um, and so I don't think they know English well enough to differentiate accents. But then when I would start speaking to them in Spanish, they'd be like, "What are you, like Cuban or Puerto Rican?" And I'd be like, "Well, close enough. The Dominican Republic is in between them." Yeah. And when I moved to Portugal, it was quite funny. A lot of people thought that I was from Brazil or that I was Angolan. So they'd be like, "What, are you from Angola?" But then they'd hear my Portuguese and they'd be like, "No, she's definitely not one of us."
Okay. Two more questions and then we are going to wrap up. So I thank you so much for your time. So I'm curious to know because I've been seeing a lot of information about Portugal being a pretty, or I guess like a relatively, I don't want to say easy, but like people on social media, they make it seem like it's easy to go from the US to Portugal and live with in Portugal for at least a year or so. How do people, like native Portuguese people, feel about Americans moving there?
Yeah, I think it was part of the reason why I had a moment where I wasn't enjoying living in Portugal very much. I think that there's a lot of tension between local Portuguese and Americans moving here because we tend to move here with higher wage paying remote jobs and they just can't keep up. You know, the highest Portuguese wage is probably about 2,000 euros a month, where like that is a very low paying job in the United States. You know, that would be, you know, who makes $2,000 a month working a remote job in the US? Like that's just, it's not a thing. And so a lot of people come here making upwards of $5,000 a month. And because previously there were tax incentives for Americans to move here, I think that they've removed some of them because the locals were literally like marching in the streets because there was a housing crisis and the cost of rent was skyrocketing, and the only people who could really afford them were these American expats, British expats, Russian expats, Danish or Swedish expats that were making way more money with their foreign remote jobs than the locals ever could. And so there's a lot of tension, I think, on kind of like a exterior level. You'll see this like make news, like front page news all of the time about the housing crisis, about Americans getting tax incentives or like skipping out on paying tax here in Portugal. And I think it creates a lot of tension. But the interesting thing is like on an individual basis, you don't feel it. Portuguese people are incredibly welcoming and friendly. So it's like you see it in the news and you see them marching in the streets, but they would never be rude at an individual basis. And I think also even just like after trying to practice more Portuguese, they are so friendly when I'm like practicing with them, and they'll even speak slower and teach me phrases. And they're just incredibly welcoming people. But yeah, I would say that there's a lot of tension economically speaking.
I see. Um, there's an element there where, like, it seems like a lot of people have, um, they don't attach the person with the situation.
Hmm.
It's kind of like how, like, what I'm getting out of that. So it's like like, they're taking their anger out on like the sources that they should voice the opinion to, like the government, um, which is great. Definitely voice, make your voice be heard in that regard, but not like take it out on the people who are kind of playing the role in the problem that's being made. I think that's mature, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, It it's quite interesting because if you speak to a Portuguese person and you ask them about the housing crisis, they would probably bring up like, "Oh, well, it's those American expats coming from California with their big tech remote jobs, you know,
Everybody hates California.
paying these paying these ridiculous deposits, and they're displacing locals." But if they met a big tech American, they would probably be so friendly to them. And so it's quite an interesting dichotomy because I think also on some levels, some of them are aware that it's like a policy issue, right? Americans are getting these huge incentives to move to Portugal, and you would think like, well, why wouldn't I take advantage of something that's available? But then on the flip side, it's like, well, where's the policy protecting local Portuguese people? So it's a tricky situation, and I hope to see more policy on the government side. I think the other issue that kind of exists is like that there's a huge brain drain going on in Portugal. So because of the economy, there's a lot of young people who leave the country, especially if they do want to work in certain sectors because it's very difficult for them to find jobs here. So they'll end up moving to the Netherlands or Switzerland or Germany to find work. And so there's a big gap of like young professionals here, I would think. And to the point where, like, now I see the government's doing incentives to retain young professionals. And even like, even I can qualify for like housing credits, even as a foreigner, as a resident here, because they're wanting to retain more young people. And I think this is an issue all over Europe where they have these like aging populations. So it's like they want to retain young people who would want to stay in the country and like have families and, keep the economy moving.
Wow. Okay. I learned something
I
new
know, girl.
today. Yeah. Okay. And Europe has its own problems, just like sounds like American problems in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, man, I just want everybody to just coexist and be happy, no matter where they are. And I like, why is that too much to ask? Like, why does rent have to increase? Like, why does property taxes have to increase? Like, there's no grandfather system or like there's I don't know, greed is just playing a role, I'm sure, in that process. Um, Complex set of issues that seems like we're all dealing with. So, yeah. Okay, very last question, and then we're gonna wrap it up. This question I ask everyone because um, I think that this platform is a safe space to reflect, whether you're a guest or actually listening. Um, so I want you to take a moment and just think about how your experience was before you left the US and the person you were in the mindset that you had in that moment. And just think about that for a moment. The question is, um, what advice would you give to the younger version of yourself? And now that you're 6 years deep and you've learned a lot, yeah, what advice would you give to the version of yourself that was longing for an escape or a way out of the madness that you endured when you were in Georgia? I'm laughing because, that like we've overcome that. But yeah,
Yeah. Um, I think the advice I would give her, which is a lot easier to give and a lot harder to take, is to not be worried when things aren't working out for you. Because I really do feel like when I was younger and being an ambitious person, I always had all of these big dreams and these big plans, a lot of which didn't come true, a lot of which, fell apart. But I have to say, like, I never imagined this life that I'm living. I never expected to move to Spain. I never expected to move to Portugal. I never expected to start a podcast about the things that I had been through. And it's so interesting the way that life will surprise you in the most magical ways when you just let it. And I think I would tell her to just not worry when things aren't working out because something even better might be on the way.
I love that. Yay. I felt like you were speaking to my inner child, like the younger version of me that was thinking like I have no control. Or so I thought. I didn't have control over anything, but I did. I had control over
Yeah.
something and I took advantage of that and it got me through a lot. So, and it got you through a lot. And it's going to get
Yes.
anyone else who's listening and
Through
struggling
a
through a
lot.
lot. With that being said, thank y'all so much for tuning in to another episode of the Relocate Podcast. Don't forget, I told y'all about Amber's podcast called the Lighthouse Within podcast. So definitely look it up on Spotify if you have any issues looking it up for whatever reason. It's pinned to my profile on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Good something. What was the name of it again? I'm sorry.
Good pods.
Good Pods.
Good
Yes,
pods.
I love that. Good Pods. I might have to look into that. It's bringing like it's giving good vibes. So, um,
Yes.
yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will check y'all or see y'all on the flip side every Wednesday.
Bye.